Dracula, the fictional count of the undead who emerged by night to drain the blood of his victims. His name would become synonymous with vampire legend. Charles Manson, charismatic cult leader, career criminal, cold-blooded killer. His name would become synonymous with the dark side of 60s counterculture. Nearly a century separates these men, their controversies, and their crimes. Or are they closer than we think? Charles Manson was born to an unwed 16-year-old mother in 1934 in Cincinnati, Ohio. Ironically, his first name of record was No Name Maddox, a moniker that would soon become Charles Mills Maddox, and then, following his mother's marriage to a man named William Eugene Manson, a third and final name, one which would become known by all and live in infamy. Things got off to a rocky start for the young Manson, with his mother receiving a 5-year prison sentence for assault and robbery before her son's 5th birthday. Sent to live with an aunt and uncle in the interim, Charles Manson would soon reunite with his mother upon her release, and not long after that, the pair would relocate to West Virginia, then Indiana. By Manson's own admission, his criminal deeds began at the tender age of 9 when he set fire to his school. More trouble followed, and when it showed no signs of slowing, the youngster was sent away to a notoriously strict facility for wayward youths, the Gibault School for Boys, run by Catholic priests. Not to be deterred from a life outside the law, Charles Manson would run away from Gibault, and for a time, live on the streets. The fugitive Manson would eventually make his way back to his mother, only to have her return him to the Gibault School. This betrayal of trust from the closest person in his life would be a defining moment for the troubled teenager. Unwilling to acquiesce, Manson fled custody again and again, each time becoming more brazen and lawless, and eventually committing a string of armed robberies. These acts would see the escalating juvenile sentenced to the Indiana Boys School, a snake pit reform school that may well have cemented the young outlaw's budding predilections. He escaped the Indiana Boys School nearly 20 times, ultimately driving a stolen car across state lines and being sentenced to federal custody in Washington, D.C. It was here that tests would reveal Charles Manson possessed an IQ of 109, despite being unable to read. To anyone who'd been paying attention, the groundwork for events to come had been laid. Count Dracula's origins are every bit as fringe and subversive as Charles Manson's, albeit intentionally more shadowy and mysterious, hence more difficult to trace with any solid chronology. What is known at the start of both Bram Stoker's classic novel and most film versions of the tale is that the Count spends some time residing in a crumbling castle in the Carpathian Mountains, out of sight and out of step with the quaint European villages below. Of course, the frightened and superstitious villagers live in fear of their neighbor above, relaying stories amongst themselves and to visitors of the dreadful consequences of venturing out after dark.
He wants me to ask if you can wait and go on after sunrise.
Well, I'm sorry, but there's a carriage meeting me at Borgo Pass at midnight.
Borgo Pass?
Yes.
Whose carriage?
Count Dracula's.
Count Dracula's?
Yes.
Castle Dracula?
Yes, that's where I'm going.
To the castle?
Yes.
No.
One of the visitors regaled with such warnings is Jonathan Harker, or Renfield, as depicted in the 1931 Universal classic. A solicitor summoned from afar to assist Dracula in purchasing property in London. Unaware of the danger he's gotten himself into, he plays right into the Count's clutches, soon finding himself and his very soul in stark peril. Dracula circles his guest, much like the predator stalking its prey, as this is indeed the true nature of their relationship, despite the fraudulent civil auspices that brought them together. By the time Jonathan Harker realizes that he's walked into a trap, it's already too late. Dracula is, as Bela Lugosi succinctly put it in his most famous performance of the character,
the spider spinning his web for the unwary fly. The blood is the life, Mr. Redfield.
Although his 3 devoted, unholy brides still prowl the castle's shadows, Dracula suddenly vacates the premises, the deed to his new London property in hand, abandoning the hapless Jonathan Harker to his ghostly trio.
Go on. You can go first. Me? First? Well, you have to ride?
The solicitor would live to tell his tale, albeit just barely. Much like Charles Manson's life decades later, the groundwork for something dreadful had been laid. Following his early incarcerations, young Charles Manson's downward spiral only quickened. By the age of 16, and doing relatively easy time in a minimum security facility, he raped a boy by knife point. Transferred to federal custody in Virginia, his infractions only worsened, until he found himself in maximum security prison in Ohio. Surprisingly, Manson would be granted early parole for good behavior. When he married a waitress, some thought Charlie might clean up his act, but they'd be sorely mistaken after he relocated to California with his new bride in a stolen car. Manson was returned to federal prison, where he would remain for a stretch, immediately engaging in activities like pimping, theft, and forgery whenever he found himself lucky enough to win parole. Ultimately spending over half his young life behind bars, Charles Manson would actually petition against his own upcoming parole, telling authorities that prison had become his home. With all roads now leading to California, Manson's most destructive act began its arc in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district, the epicenter of 60s counterculture and a shining beacon to those looking to tune in, turn on, and drop out. Haight-Ashbury attracted the marginalized, disenfranchised, and alternative, like moths to a flame. To fringe players like Charlie Manson, it was as close to home as the penitentiary. Like Count Dracula before him, Manson attracted a coterie of dedicated followers, mostly teenage girls and young women, some from the city's underbelly, and some, like Susan Atkins and Leslie Van Houten, from the suburbs.
And you'll find you, now is when on a sunshine beam. So bring only your perfection, for their love will surely be. No cold pain, fear, or hunger.
Upon moving into the apartment of college graduate and library assistant Mary Bruner, Manson opened the floodgates. Soon, Mary's modest dwelling housed 18 other women, highlighting a level of dark charisma that might exasperate even Count Dracula. One of the most talked about facets of the Manson family is the sheer number of young women who willingly signed on, seemingly fiercely devoted and all-forgiving of some of the more unsavory details of day-to-day life in the family. And while some differing narratives have emerged in later years, when the family was together, one thing was always clear. Everyone was all in. While Susan Atkins, Leslie Van Houten, and Patricia Krenwinkel are undeniably 3 of history's most visible and notorious female members of the Klan, there were more, many of whom are out there to this day, having gone on with their lives, their past affiliations buried by the sands of time. Women like Catherine Scher, Sandra Good, Barbara Hoyt, Diane Lake, Kitty Lutzinger, Linda Kasabian, and Mary Bruner, who both would take the stand to testify as state's witnesses, and the infamous Lynette Squeaky Fromm, who, as it turned out, was far from finished with mayhem despite her fellow members' 1971 convictions and initial death sentences. In 1975, Squeaky met with President Gerald Ford under the auspices of discussing California's imperiled redwood trees. She pulled a gun on the president and was swiftly detained by Secret Service agents.
A woman identified as Manson follower Lynn Alice Squeaky Fromm of Sacramento was held by Secret Service and police while the president continued on to the Capitol. Witnesses heard Miss Fromm say at one point, "It didn't go off. Can you believe it didn't go off?"
Although she wasn't able to fire a shot, the intent alone netted Fromm a life sentence. Joining her former family behind bars, she would escape in 1987, going on the run for 2 days, before being caught and returned to prison. She was ultimately paroled in 2009, joining Clem Grogan as only the second family member and first woman to be paroled after her conviction. Not much is detailed about the origins and backgrounds of the brides of Dracula in either the original novel or the various films adapted therefrom. What is understood is that the women fell prey at some point to the blood-sucking Count, and as a result of his unholy bite, were damned to exist as members of the undead forever, or until their destruction. As readers and viewers, we can fill in any of these characters' blanks we so choose, but what's clearly more vivid is the parallel with the girls of the Manson family, living in seclusion with a male figurehead, either obeying his explicit instructions or simply following the protocols of the path less traveled. They exist outside the realm of society's norms and conventions. In the same way one could look at Charles Manson's influence on the array of young women who gravitated to his orbit as figuratively vampiric, Dracula's function is literally so. The vampire's bite is contagious and transformative, begetting another bite, this time delivered by the victim, thereby creating another victim and member of the undead, and so on and so forth. In some versions of the Dracula story, the three brides feed on Jonathan Harker, nearly killing him before he narrowly escapes their clutches. This situation somewhat mirrors the trap set by Susan Atkins when she lured an unwitting Shorty Shea to his death at the hands of 2 other family members. The relationships between the brides is also rarely, if ever, clarified. Their creator, Bram Stoker, refers to them as the sisters, but it's doubtful the term implies blood relations, unless Dracula's is the blood in question. And while there's a palpable sexual undercurrent to their presence, it's more probable that their simmering lust is purely and simply for blood. One common trait, however, remains clear when comparing the brides of Dracula and the Manson girls: their unwavering dedication to their appointed figureheads. Whether taken as a father figure, an object of desire, addiction, or all of the above, the women project their wants and needs on the men in question, and both men serve their own ends with measured manipulation.
Bitter? No.
When music teacher Gary Hinman ran afoul of Charlie's tightening circle, the startling nature of Manson's power and grip on his associates revealed itself. After being abducted, beaten, and shaken down for money, Hinman was ultimately stabbed to death by family member Bobby Beausoleil. Unbeknownst to many at the time, this crime would prove to be a tipping point for the terrible headline-making events soon to follow. One of the more fascinating comparisons to be made is the curious link between the psychotic Dracula character of R.M. Renfield and the murderous Manson acolyte, Bobby Beausoleil. Both men begin their arcs young and accomplished, with presumably their whole lives laid out before them. Yet both would suffer the fatal flaw of falling under the spell of exactly the wrong sort of influence. In Renfield's case, it was Count Dracula who would derail his life's trajectory. And in Beausoleil's, Charles Manson. A resident of Dr. John Seward's sanitarium at the start of Bram Stoker's Dracula, Renfield displays the startling trait of eating living creatures to absorb their life force for himself. Spiders, flies, moths, and birds all fall prey to Renfield's urges until he finally makes the leap to a human being and slashes Dr. Seward, drawing blood from the warden's arm to slurp from the floor. When Dr. Van Helsing and company become privy to the fact that the Count is telepathically operating through the lunatic Renfield, the noose begins to tighten. With the end drawing nearer, Renfield has a crisis of conscience and attempts to combat the Count's supernatural hold on him. Dracula's power, however, proves too much for the young madman, and he's ultimately killed by the vampire he called Master, ending once and for all the tragedy of R.M. Renfield. As for Bobby Beausoleil, the young musician and actor appeared primed for big things, or an interesting and creative life at the very least. A juvenile ex-con and drifter by the age of 15, Bobby's artistic skills saw him gravitate toward figures in the entertainment industry, who quickly recognized the scrappy youngster's talents. But when he became acquainted with the hippies out on Spawn Ranch, things took a hard U-turn for the worst. Being the roommate of the ill-fated Gary Hinman, 21-year-old Bobby found himself in the convenient position of being the one family member who could get closest to Hinman, once the music teacher crossed the streetwise Charlie Manson and found himself with a debt to pay. Bobby held Hinman hostage and tortured him for 3 days, along with Charlie, who infamously severed Hinman's ear with either a bayonet or a samurai sword, depending on which version of the story is to be believed. Soon after the bloody assault, the decision was made. Hinman had to die. Beausoleil stabbed Gary repeatedly, and then smothered him with a pillow, with the aid of Susan Atkins and Mary Bruner. The trio then employed the infamous family habit of leaving a message in blood to throw authorities off their trail. At a later court hearing, Beausoleil was famously quoted saying, "I'm at war with everybody in this courtroom. You better pray I never get out." Just like Dracula's Renfield, too weak-willed to realize he was being puppeteered by a master manipulator until it was too late, so did Bobby put his trust in Charles Manson and his family of acolytes. This error in judgment would spell ruin for the young man, who was given a life sentence at the tender age of 22. Beginning in 1978, Bobby Beausoleil received 18 parole hearings, ultimately to be rejected by the governor of California. Seems the authorities took him at his word all those years ago. Just as Charles Manson arrived in California with all the quietly destructive force of a deadly spreading disease, so did Count Dracula infiltrate city life in England to find a whole society of unwitting victims. Mingling undetected in their midst, the vampire carefully chooses his moments to strike, evading all early attempts to identify and stop him. When a healthy young woman named Lucy Westenra suddenly falls mysteriously ill and dies, Dr. Abraham Van Helsing deduces the cause of the tragedy as the work of a vampire. And, as newspapers soon begin reporting sightings of a beautiful woman terrorizing children around the city, Van Helsing convinces a group of friends to accompany him after dark to the local cemetery where Lucy was laid to rest. There, the men discover to their horror that the doctor's vampire theory is true, and that Lucy has become a vampire who emerges from her grave to prowl the city in search of blood. With no other options, they destroy the creature of the night by driving a stake through her heart. And with that, the inevitable hunt for Dracula begins. Joined by Lucy's best friend Mina Murray and the now recovered Jonathan Harker, who fills in the blanks for Dr. Van Helsing and Company by relaying his treacherous encounter with Count Dracula. The forces of good firmly aligned against the Prince of Darkness, prepared to stop his reign of terror at any cost. Just as Charles Manson exploited the vulnerable outcasts around him to gain their trust and devotion before using them as pawns in a sinister game, so too did Count Dracula, using the mental patient Renfield to gain entry to the asylum where his hunters have shored up against him, believing themselves safe. Similar to the early Manson family habit of stealing into houses in the dead of night to mischievously rearrange furniture, steal items, or just observe people sleep, an activity known as creepy crawling, Dracula begins visiting the sleeping Mina, draining her blood to slowly turn her to the dark side. Without question, the Count's manipulation of the poor fool Renfield to gain access to his enemies and attack them from within their own safe haven was the tipping point for the terrible events to follow. After a life spent bucking the system and breaking the law, Charles Manson's highest profile crimes occurred over 2 blood-drenched nights in August of 1969. To the outside world, it was just another summer of love, the fruition of the hippie ethos that had swept America just a couple years prior and transformed the country's landscape from the straight-laced apple pie society of the 50s into the free-love, free-for-all of a new and vocal youth movement. But for the insular Manson family and their 5 unwitting victims, the midnight hour of August 9th may as well have been the eve of Armageddon. Just like Dracula holed up in his crumbling castle ruins before arriving in the big city to wreak bloody mayhem, so did members of the Manson family set out from their remote desert compound, the abandoned movie location known as the Spahn Ranch, to prowl the night for blood sacrifice. Or, as Charles Manson himself allegedly stated,
as they were pulling out of the ranch driveway, Manson stopped the car, stuck his head in the window, and said, "Leave a sign. You girls know what I mean, something witchy."
As Charles Manson's murder trial was proceeding in 1970, a wildfire wiped out the Spahn Ranch, reducing all previous buildings and items that remained to ash. Nevertheless, the spot where the ranch once stood will forever be a notorious sprawl of acreage in Los Angeles County. In its early years, the property changed hands twice, becoming a film location for the Hollywood industry in 1947, and eventually ending up in the possession of a man named George Spahn. Spahn added horse rentals to the property's offerings, but along with the American movie Western, the ranch slid into a long, slow decline. By the late 60s, with Hollywood having moved on, the Spahn Ranch was all but abandoned. This caught the attention of a rogue band of glorified squatters, who would soon be known to the rest of the world as the Manson family. With his health in decline and having fallen on hard times, the 80-year-old George Spahn was living full-time on the ranch when he struck a deal with the hippie clique to move in free of charge, in exchange for tending the grounds, and in a few of the girls' cases, tending to George.
Time keeps on flying.
When Shorty Shea, one of Spahn's former employees, had a falling out with Manson, it would prove to be the first of several fatal encounters innocent people would have with the family. Susan Atkins tricked Shea into accompanying her to a secluded area of the sprawling acreage, where 2 other family members were waiting to attack. Bruce Davis and Clem Grogan murdered Shea and buried his body in a remote shallow grave, where it would remain until 1977, when Clem finally revealed its whereabouts to police. Other salacious tales would circulate over the years about sundry crimes and decomposed corpses in unmarked graves, but despite the seemingly endless rumor mill, no other bodies would be found. However, an eruption of grisly mass murder like the one that occurred on that hot summer weekend rarely comes out of nowhere. And whether there are other victims somewhere remains a distinct possibility. A notorious sprawl in its own right, Castle Dracula is the dwelling of the king of vampires when his classic story begins. A foreboding domicile, it provides an all-encompassing sense of menace, and a looming and ominous backdrop to the misadventures of the Count's first victim.
Welcome to my home.
Although the castle is fictional, it does bear some loose similarities with a Romanian national landmark known as Bran Castle. Currently functioning as a museum, the castle remains widely associated with the Dracula legend, due in large part to its tourist-inspired nickname of Dracula's Castle. Upon closer inspection, one can draw a much stronger comparison between the remote Transylvanian castle and the remote California ranch, as well as both locations' murderous occupants. Spahn Ranch existed in seclusion, surrounded by rumors spread by those who knew of it or had dealings there. Castle Dracula stood in such seclusion it may as well have been in its own world, with a nightmarish reputation bolstered by the terrified residents of surrounding villages. Count Dracula and his undead brides lay in wait for his oblivious solicitor to arrive, in the same way Charles Manson and friends devised ambushes for rivals like Shorty Shea, who were foolish enough to walk into their trap. Neither the ranch nor the castle was a place any sane visitor would care to find themselves alone, after dark, or at all. With nowhere to run and nowhere to hide, targets were doomed at times to fates worse than death. And the respective residents of Spahn Ranch and Castle Dracula could, and would, do as they pleased with their trapped victims, without fear of reprisal or retribution. While this unadulterated freedom to exist by their own rules served Count Dracula and Charles Manson well, both of their downfalls were precipitated by their own brazen overreaches. Dracula ventures forth to claim victims in the city, but soon he is identified. With his foes in pursuit, the vampire flees back to the safety of his castle walls, where he is ultimately cornered and destroyed. Manson, while not being present for his family's most infamous crime, surely knew their intentions on the night of August 9th, 1969. And when he did participate in the LaBianca home invasion on the very next night, he clearly knew and condoned the severity of their spree. Wantonly leaving the security of their remote compound to claim victims from the city is exactly what hastened the identification and apprehension of the group, who might otherwise have operated under the radar for far longer than they did. Another parallel to be drawn is that which exists between the survivors of a vampire's bite and those who turn their backs on their flesh and blood relatives to live and sometimes kill with the Manson family. One might arrive at the conclusion that becoming a vampire and joining a cult are two extreme examples of the groupthink mentality that can pervade schools, workplaces, social media platforms, or any arena where groups of people mingle. And there is some truth in the assessment. But just as it takes a powerful force to bite an average human and turn them into a blood-craving fiend by night, it's a special kind of dark influence that can warp the minds of regular citizens enough to turn them into bloodthirsty spree killers. Traditionally, those unfortunate enough to incur the bite of the vampire, but who are not drained of so much blood that the result is death, find themselves cursed to walk the night with the insatiable craving for blood that drives the same one who bit them. In short, the bite of a vampire creates a vampire. In the case of the Manson family, steady drug use and insular lifestyles, combined with exposure to increasingly radical rhetoric, is what seems to have given the final nudge to some members who may have previously only teetered on the brink of extreme antisocial behavior. When Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian descended upon Cielo Drive in the midnight hour of August 9th, whether or not one believes the prosecutor's Draculian tale that the dark leader Charles Manson was controlling their collective minds, the fact remains clear that Tex Watson led the charge on the night's gruesome actions with an apocalyptic and merciless bloodlust that would not be quelled until everyone he encountered lay dead. In the story of Dracula, Lucy Westenra and R.M. Renfield are the victims of the nefarious vampire's marionette string pullings, but throughout history's ample cinematic and literary vampire tellings, many characters have acted against their own wills, compelled by sinister supernatural forces stronger than their best inclinations. Indeed, the idea of losing control of oneself so fully that one becomes the very thing previously feared most seems to be an eternal point of fascination in the human mind. Many factors figure into the psychological mix of vampire legend. Religion, sexuality, and an individual's moral compass all play a part. But at its heart, the idea of the vampire can be boiled down to the age-old human conflict of life versus death, and the possibility of a life after death. There's a sense of spooky fun in reading or watching a vampire story from the safety of one's own home, where the imaginary terrors lurking in the night can't reach us. Sadly, this was not the case on the weekend of August 9th. Vampire lore holds that, in order to claim a victim at home, a vampire must first be invited in by the homeowner. If that were the case, 7 people may have lived to see another day. Tex Watson and his cohorts gained entry to the Cielo Drive house by cutting the screen of an open window to surprise the occupants as their night was winding down. And it was also Tex Watson who entered the LaBianca residence just a day later, and along with Van Houten and Krenwinkel, slaughtered the homeowners. While history paints Charles Manson's figure looming over these crimes like a malevolent specter, the fact remains that on that summer weekend, Charles Manson didn't murder anybody. One of a vampire's most fearsome and effective weapons is the use of mind control. And as was successfully argued by the Los Angeles prosecutor's office, Charles Manson was guilty of the same.
The other end of your society, so you can ride your bicycles and do your thing. I live in your reform schools and your orphanages. I'm not against you. I'm not against you. Huh?
Are you bitter?
Bitter? No.
But you feel you've paid some price so far in your life.
Price?
To society, you said it.
Yeah, okay.
While the average citizen may be confounded at the idea of being driven to murder by the mere suggestion of a third party, those who lived with the family remained steadfast, gathering on the street corners outside or coming into court every day to show their support. Manson acolytes Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian arrived at director Roman Polanski's home on Cielo Drive in Los Angeles' Benedict Canyon and proceeded to systematically slaughter everyone they encountered. Polanski's wife, film star Sharon Tate, stylist to the stars Jay Sebring, coffee heiress Abigail Folger, fledgling screenwriter Wojciech Frykowski, and 18-year-old Stephen Parent, who was only briefly visiting the property to sell a stereo. All paid the ultimate price, simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The killings were shocking, savage, merciless, and would, partly due to Sharon Tate's celebrity renown, resonate far beyond the walls of the house on Cielo Drive, to rock the entire nation to its core. Much like Bela Lugosi's eternal film version of The Count, when he greets the doomed Renfield with the ominous line,
"I am Dracula."
So too did Tex Watson hover over a helpless Frykowski, offering the notorious line,
"I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business."
The following night, more business would be conducted, when members of the murderer's family, assisted by Charles Manson himself, invaded the home of grocery store owners Lino and Rosemary LaBianca, mercilessly butchering the couple and desecrating the bodies, vandalizing the home, and helping themselves to snacks, before stealing back into the night with yet more blood on their hands. For his part, with open access to the hero's dwelling, Dracula begins invading the bedroom of Mina Murray. He drains her blood on 3 consecutive nights, weakening the woman's will with each episode, and culminates with commanding her to drink his own blood. Once this is done, Mina is cursed to become a vampire herself. That is, unless the Count can be destroyed beforehand. To achieve this end, Van Helsing's team places holy bread in each of the Count's boxes of native soil, thereby eliminating them as the vampire's refuge during daylight hours. Fortunately for the heroes, Mina's compromised status gives her a psychic connection to Dracula, which Van Helsing takes full advantage of, enabling the group to follow the fleeing vampire back to his Transylvanian homeland. With dogged determination and unwavering bravery, Van Helsing and company finally track down and destroy Count Dracula, ending his bloody reign once and for all. Although authorities would raid the Spahn Ranch and arrest Charles Manson for auto theft in the interim, months would pass before Los Angeles police became privy to the Manson family and its anarchic namesake's connection to the 7 brutal slayings that occurred that fateful August weekend. Once the head of the snake was figuratively cut off, much like decapitating a vampire so that it will rise no more, the real circus began. Despite a ridiculously far-fetched courtroom narrative by earnest prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi that struck some observers as pure fiction, a riveted public followed the spectacle closely, with a collective morbid curiosity previously unseen in American criminal justice. Headlines nationwide decried those drugged-up murderous hippies in California, and Americans from coast to coast began fastidiously doing something that was an afterthought just a decade earlier. They made extra sure to lock their doors and windows at night. Even the President of the United States chimed in, with Richard Nixon publicly declaring his opinion of the family's guilt. An ironic act, given the headlines he himself would make later in his second term. Every story's villain requires a foil, and both the immortal undead Count Dracula and the eternally infamous Charles Manson prove no different. Enter Dr. Abraham Van Helsing and prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi, respectively. Two accomplished men who find themselves tasked with toppling foes so feared and mythologized that their missions are wildly daunting and fraught with peril, to say the least. Described by his own creator, author Bram Stoker, as, quote, one of the most advanced scientists of his day, Van Helsing is further credited with an iron nerve, a temper of the icebrook, and indomitable resolution, self-command, and toleration exalted from virtues to blessings, and the kindliest and truest heart that beats. These form his equipment for the noble work that he is doing for mankind. Work both in theory and practice, for his views are as wide as his all-embracing sympathy. A lofty description, and all traits the Doctor would undoubtedly need to properly combat and defeat such a towering nemesis as the vampire Dracula. Some circles bestow these same caveats upon Vincent Bugliosi, a man whose dogged preparation and steadfast resolution in the courtroom would, in 1970, bring down the most publicized and notorious criminal America had ever seen.
Well, when company comes, you always stick the dirt in the back.
Well, this was a definition of helter-skelter that Charlie gave. Now, if you look at this White album, it's a Beatles album, there are many other songs. One of them is called Sexy Sadie. Sadie Glutz, also known as Susan Atkins, whatever you want to call her, she thought that the Beatles named this song after her. There's also a song called Piggies. There's also a song...
What is it in the helter-skelter song?
Nothing particularly in that song right there, except the definition that Manson gave of it.
He doesn't see in the back. He doesn't see in the shadows. He doesn't see on the roadsides. He doesn't see in the back of the cells. He doesn't see in the yard in the penitentiary. You take the bottom of the world. He doesn't see the bottom.
There's another song in that same album called Blackbirds, talking about blackbirds fixing their wings and rising up. Charles Manson said the blackbird meant the black man.
The penitentiary is in the background, the think chambers. These are all think chambers.
Do guys belong on a death row or a condemned row, if there is such a row? They belong in a place like this, if they've been convicted of murder and killing?
Most of the people in here are just your reflections. They're your mistakes, so, as a collective society.
Even though they have rebelled against that society?
Well, they weren't born rebelling. They weren't born with the anger and frustration that they have. That had to be put on them by somebody. Somebody created them.
To ignite helter-skelter, to start the black-white revolution, Manson envisioned that white people would turn against the black man if they thought the black man had committed these 7 murders, and ultimately there would be a civil war between blacks and whites out on the street.
Your outside world programs people into education and knowledge. The inside unprograms people to wisdom and understanding.
And that helter-skelter, as far out and as unbelievable and as bizarre as it is, was one of the prime motives for these murders. Now, keep in mind, the prosecution does not have the burden of proving motives.
What do you think?
I'm the one who's asking you.
Yeah, but if I don't give you the answer that you want...
Doesn't matter to me.
It doesn't matter.
It's your opinion.
However, just as film actors like Peter Cushing and Anthony Hopkins interpreted some of Van Helsing's more flawed and obsessive traits, Bugliosi, although cast as the hero against a villain whom much of the world regarded as diabolical as Satan himself, was not a man without contradictions and glaring flaws of his own. When a Los Angeles milkman came forward with accusations of stalking and harassment because Bugliosi believed the man was having an affair with his wife, the accusations scuttled his run for county DA. And an alleged assault against a pregnant mistress that resulted in her miscarriage further soiled Vince's carefully cultivated good guy persona, calling into question the character of the man who spent decades trumpeting justice for all. Bugliosi's helter-skelter race war explanation that so famously secured the convictions for Manson and his co-defendants has been widely viewed as suspect, and outright refuted by multiple members of the family, as well as by Manson himself. Ever the earnest deputy district attorney, Vincent Bugliosi was not about to let myriad holes in his fantastical theory get in the way of a verdict.
But this is an issue that the jury was already aware of. This came out, in fact, during the prosecution's case in chief. I will have a response to that, too. I think the jury will be looking for an answer to that, and I do intend to respond to it.
The nation was riveted, and all eyes were watching closely. Manson and his gang were on the hook, and Bugliosi would be damned if he let those big fish get away. Just as Dr. Van Helsing trailed the fleeing Dracula all the way back to Transylvania, so did Bugliosi follow the members of the family down the psychedelic rabbit hole, where down was up, wrong was right, and the straight world was left far behind. If the prosecutor's office had to invent motives from a hippie horror movie playbook to achieve his ends, so be it.
Do you intend in your rebuttal to answer all of those points individually?
No, if I did that, Stan, I'd probably be there for about a week or so. I'm only going to respond to those points which, in my estimation, the jury wants an answer to. If I feel that the point is frivolous and they're not concerned with it, I'm certainly not going to take up the jury's time.
And to be fair, Manson and his clan made it easy for the state to sensationalize their trial, with wild courtroom outbursts and street corner spectacles that made the circus seem dull in comparison. Like Hammer Horror's Van Helsing before him, who famously relayed his dalliances with darkness into a dictaphone, Bugliosi would go on to write a book about his work on the Manson trial. To say his account was a success would be a vast understatement, as Helter Skelter quickly cemented its place as one of the most read true crime books ever written, regardless of whether every detail contained in its pages is truth or not. So, false narrative or unflinching deep dive into madness and murder, penned by the one man who personally unraveled the whole sordid mess. As with many things regarding Charles Manson, the truth may forever be entangled with the myth. When the dust finally settled, following the longest and craziest roller coaster ride of a murder trial America had ever seen, Charles Manson and each of his associates were found guilty and convicted on all counts of crimes which by 1971 had insinuated their way into the public consciousness and would inform nightmares forevermore. For his long-awaited sentencing, Manson would shave his head and fork his beard, echoing for the trained microphones Tex Watson's ominous line from 2 years earlier when he stated, "I am the devil, and the devil always has a bald head." Or, as uttered by a different monster, in a different time, a darkly charismatic usurper whose deliberate actions would also facilitate his own downfall.
I am Dracula.
If we look close enough, in the right light, Count Dracula's tale is rife with comparisons to Charles Manson's. From brainwashed brides to bedroom break-ins. From plotting mayhem in isolated compounds to brazen bloodlust for innocent victims. Count Dracula emerged from the shadows, cloaked in the nightmares and rumors of those who knew his imminent menace best. By that same token, Charles Manson emerged from the penitentiaries he'd grown to call home, awash in the files and reports of those who knew all too well the dangers he posed. No amount of awareness by these appointed guardians would be enough to prevent the horrors that would soon ensue with these two monsters on the loose. Indeed, both Manson and Dracula, stars of their own dark operas, acted as virtual wrecking balls to the respective societies they targeted. Decades have separated them, one operating in the realm of fiction, the other in the all-too-real world.
They say that eyebrows that meet in the middle mean that you've got homicidal tendencies. So, you know.
How are you different from the maniacs on the outside? And why do you call them maniacs? Because you know something, they think you are one.
Yeah, it would reflect. If you hold the negative up to the light, you don't see the light, you just see the negative. So I'm a reflection of your negative. There's no doubt about that.
Action.
I've been up and down these damn hallways, in and out of these nut wards for the last 10 years. You think you could follow that act?
Don't want to follow that act.
Yeah,
I don't want to get into it. But why do you want to get into that?
Well, what crowd,
why do you
what
want
crowd
to
you playing for?
Huh?
I'm playing for my life. You working for money.
What does that mean, you're playing for your life?
I'm working for my life, mister. I'm not playing for money.
What do you mean you're working
for keeps?
I mean you're working for your life.
I'm playing for real.
What does that mean, you're playing for real? How are you
That's
playing for
something
your
you
life?
can't buy.
When you say you're playing for your life, am I to
Yeah.
assume that you think that someday you're going to get out of here?
Get out of here. Get out of here. Where would I go? Let's see. I got out of here.
What if they said to you tomorrow morning, Charles, hey, listen, you're free. You can go wherever you want to go. Do whatever you want to do. What would you do?
I'll probably go out in front on the grass and sit down.
The character of Count Dracula is generally destroyed at the end of every telling of his tale. Of course, entertainment never lets a pesky thing like death keep a good bad guy down. And to date, Dracula has returned to wreak havoc in countless productions of the stage and screen. Charles Manson died in prison in 2017, and while he won't be resurrected like the Count, his crimes and his infamy will also live forever. Two different villains in two different worlds. But as we've come to find out, they're closer than we think.
My world is a sad world. I often wondered if there's blame. Such a fool in a mad, mad world, with no picture in my frame. Everyone says crazy fool, you're always gazing at the night. With my arms around the tree, loving life with all my might. Crazy as I may seem, not knowing what to do, living with one crazy dream in a frantic world of blue. I awake every evening and somehow stumble through the night. Such a fool in a mad world, loving life with all my might. My world is a sad world, often wondered if there's blame. Such a fool in a mad, mad world, with no pictures in my frame. Loving you without a name, with no love, no one to blame.
What do you think?
Everything. Nothing.
To die, to be really dead, that must be glorious.
When the evening sun goes down, you're gonna find me hanging around. Hey, this nightlife, it ain't no good life, but it's my life. Hey, many people, all like me, always dreaming of a home you used to be. This nightlife, oh, it's a no good life, baby, but it's my life. Can't you listen to the blues they're playing? Oh man, it's really fine. Listen, can't you hear what the blues are saying? Saying, baby, won't you please come back and be mine? Well, life is another scene of broken hearts and broken dreams. Oh, the nightlife, it's a no good life, and it shouldn't be a dog's life. Well, give me a little time. You know, I'm not used to a lot of people. You know, who's people, man?
And a lot of people ain't used to you.
People, yeah. Yeah, well, I think it'll take a little while for that. If they don't catch me first and lock me up behind some brick wall somewhere. Of course, it wouldn't be hard. I'm always here.